Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
Welcome back to Pasture Prime Time with your host, myself, Neil Smith. Today we're joined by Blair Guppy, a landscape architect whose work reimagines how we live with the land. Blair specializes in regenerative, climate adaptive design, weaving ecology, culture, creativity into living systems that heal as they grow. His practice moves beyond aesthetics. It's about relationships between soil, water, people, and places, past and future. And I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today, Blair, to talk about some of the synergies that both of us live in terms of the work we do. Myself, a little more agricultural land focused, yourself, a broader breadth of knowledge base. But before we dive into any of our synergies and similarities and, where we come from in terms of our different backgrounds, I'd love maybe if you could share with the audience a little bit about your journey and who you are and why you've ended up where you've ended up.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Well, as we've talked about before, it's ironic that we're here talking together, having kind of sounds like grown up not very far from one another in right. British Columbia. And so I think you were in Whistler and I was in Horseshoe Bay, which are literally about an hour and a half apart, and certainly in a landscape that is profoundly impactful in ways I don't think I really realized until much later in life. And now living in Brooklyn and New York City, certainly I've appreciated that experience and that upbringing even more so now. So I think I am a landscape architect, and a lot of people still don't really understand what that is. The question that I get, or the request I get often when I share what I do with somebody, usually revolves around beautifying their backyard or their rooftop plants or something. So I've struggled with that, and I think our profession has struggled with that to this day. And I think it's the word landscape that sort of just is so vast that it's hard for people to understand it the same way they understand buildings. So if we think of buildings as objects, well designed in their own right, regenerative potentially in their own right, and beneficial to us as humans needing places to live, I think a landscape architect's role extends pretty much to everything else beyond its walls. And so when we think of the world that you're in, I think, which has been fascinating to me since we've kind of developed a relationship, is this idea that I was educated in a practice that and a training that really talks about designing the world around us using the natural world, like architects use inert materials. And so as I've worked for now 15 plus out of the 20 plus years in a very dense urban environment, my goal continues to be, how do we increase the amount of natural world in our urban spaces? I think that both New York City and Vancouver share a lot of similarities and synergies in ways that I've also seen in both worlds as I go back and forth between those two cities, in promising ways that give me a lot of optimism about this place, taking a lot of what Vancouver has sort of put on the world stage in terms of sustainability and goals and commitments to really improving the planet. I have a master's in landscape architecture, and I say that not as a sort of to express any sort of degree or title around that, because I think that it is a training that is probably less so in some respects than a bachelor's program. But what it did permit me was to have a background in environmental psychology and the psychology disciplines as a whole, which I think has really impacted my process and the way I think about the world, and my place and our place in it. And it really is focused on understanding people first. But this ocean of sustainability or resilience or now regenerative buzzwords that we've seen kind of through time, not wrongly so, but ideas get attached to them of all sorts, maybe diluting it to some degree in each case, but ultimately it is what we're striving for. But I mentioned my background because again, it's figuring out how we can achieve a more sustainable, resilient, and regenerative world by first understanding the human condition, which by nature somewhat fights and grapples with this idea of nature. And if we don't understand nature in the first place, we are challenged to get to a place as urbanization continues to grow exponentially to support those systems that we need. And so if we think of our childhoods growing up in mountains where, this place where the land meets the sea, and the ecology and the life that happens in such a small sliver of the world just doesn't exist in so many places around the world. So how can you expect a child who doesn't grow up in nature to then support nature later in life and to understand the complexities required to make change?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you bring up some really great points there, and for our audience, I find it quite remarkable that we did grow up so close together, and yet, both ended up on the eastern seabank of North America here. I'm still based in Canada, you're in the US, but our work still in servitude takes us all around North America and other places. But a lot of what you've talked about is a resonance to how we fix broken lines. So, those people that didn't grow up with nature around them, how do we continue to edify and introduce nature? I was actually reminded about something I read not too long ago, which was a really good post. It was on LinkedIn somewhere, and it said one of the worst designs in human history has to be the porcelain toilet. Because in one flush, we broke Earth's most sacred relationship, which is the return. The toilet is functional, and we've all grown up with it in some degree or another around the world. But it doesn't do anything other than, create a exodus or an extractive nature for what we as humans want, and not thinking about that relationship with Earth. And I found it intriguing because it was well written, and in one or two paragraphs, it kind of grappled onto something that I struggle to talk about on a regular basis, and something I think you discuss on a regular basis too, which is, landscapes and ecosystems need better understanding, and so that we can jointly coexist with this nature, whatever that nature looks like, and that changes bioregionally around the world. But we force it as humans. We force ourselves into these systems, these natural systems, and then we're puzzled when things don't work or things start breaking down, or the plan didn't go according to nature, and nature had different ideas. Just recently, I was as recently as last week talking to somebody who's does a lot of growing in the bottom of seabeds. Waterways that have either been moved or shifted or no longer present, and they're quite concerned because they're not getting the same yields, and the productivity down there is changing. And what's happening is that the aquifers underneath are actually starting to rise up. Nature's found its way back to this natural course that it was once on, i.e. the natural hydrology of water flow as it heads back out into the oceans. And I said, that's just because we forced it to be a growing condition, and it was never meant to be an agricultural growing zone. We just turned it into that. And so we got to let nature take its course. But I would like to pick up on that thread of, where are some of the, outside of the buzzwords, where are some of the broken lines that you're really focusing on today in terms of the design elements of what you're getting into?
Yeah. I think there's many of them. I sort of, and even what you're just mentioning here, I mean, we're always learning of nature, and it's a iterative process in that way, because we're sort of, like you say, imposing change, and then it just naturally adapts, kind of like humans, right? And so I think the broken lines, and I'll go right to sort of my own professional work, and it's interesting just coming back from our national conference, annual conference, this past weekend.
That's right. You were down New Orleans, yeah, that's right.
So thousands of students and practitioners and academicians sort of descended on the city for a few days, and including a very, for me, which was really impactful, was this finally starting to hear sort of some more voices from the Indigenous cultures, not only sort of outside, but particularly inside our profession, that have probably been there forever and just becoming more vocal and more supported. But so this idea of equity was an interesting line to think about. If we're talking about sort of broken lines, that's one that has been completely broken for too long. And I think that I had a lot of discussions with people from different nations while I was down there, and expressing to them as a Canadian, where the country has been dealing with reconciliation now for a number of years, and growing up was, particularly in Vancouver, I think the First Nations was so present in our lives, or at least my life, and was, I think, heavily influential in not only my perspective on the world, but in how we treat it. And I think there's so many lessons and so much wisdom there that is just overlooked, and it's become it's bordering on appropriation in so many ways. And I think that if we can lift those voices, that's not a bad thing, at the risk of some of that. But I think that's one of the lines that is becoming increasingly a sort of focus for our profession. The other one, I think, is this idea of mine that I was down there to pitch, which is this notion of finance. And I know you've been you're operating in this space, and you've taught me a lot since we've known each other in this, and in some ways kind of inspired the beginning of this journey for me professionally, is that landscape architecture is and remains outside of climate finance. And we're the ones that are building, designing, and stewarding a lot of these projects that are impactful on the planet in positive ways. And so how do we as practitioners find a place and use our voice within that to advocate for reallocating a lot of the funding and capital flows that are out there going to the wrong places? How do we quit punishing harmful actions, and how do we incentivize more and more of these positive sort of pursuits? So those are kind of like two sort of really close to my heart kind of focuses for the next stage, if you will.
Yeah, I really love that, Blair. And first of all, I think it's a mutually beneficial relationship. You've taught me a lot. I'm happy to share some of the knowledge. But it leans in a little bit to what an unspoken ethos that we have at Grow, which is really mirroring tradition with technology. And whether that's in the design side and whether that's in the, decentralized modeling and, taking into account some of that as finance as well. I think tradition, and you said it very well. I mean, we grew up, the Squamish Nation, Little Nation, very prominent in our lives on the west coast of Canada. I note First Nation art directly behind you there. It looks a little bit like a Haida Gwaii art piece. It was something that we just lived with and was part of our everyday lives. And it wasn't about the reconciliation or, some of those components, but it was very much a understanding that there is that traditional component in everything that we were doing. And, the First Nations people had some very unique ways to integrate nature that, we were adapting and learning to and trying to figure out. I find it fascinating because I grew up in a little place just up the road from you where there was a lot of multiculturalism. They all came to ski. And within that multiculturalism, there was this connection point. And it actually fascinated me so much. It's kind of why I moved away from Whistler and I started getting very fascinated with peoples and, different places. That there's a similar chord and everyone bonded with that harmony or that natural world that Whistler offered. Regardless of profession. And it was just this vast, I don't even know the word to talk about it, but the vibe, the energy that came off it, this, ecosystem that, provided so many different outlets. And yet we all felt that same, awe is maybe the best word to use. And I think in some of the work that I've seen you do and landscape architects as a whole, when it comes into urban centers, is trying to reinstill some of that awe that you can find in mountain regions and less developed areas like rural North America and agriculture zones. But when we get into the urban centers, we lose that awe. We get into the grit and the grimy. And so I really love that. The other side of that is I think there's a lot more, the people I talk with, and maybe you find this to be true, when they think about landscape architects, they're just thinking about greening a zone, right? I think about landscape architecture akin to what I do, which is we're not just greening. We're not just putting trees in to reduce the heat. We're actually finding systems, and there's an integration of, agroforestry in the city, teaching people how to create more resilience on their food, the soils, the water. And I have this vision, particularly in New York, that one day we should be able to take an older building that's currently tied to all the city systems and grids, take it completely off and do a complete revitalization design on it, where we have indoor growing, outdoor growing, we have renewable energies, we're circulating and filtering our own water systems to say, hey, you know what, in an area like New York, in a dense population, we can actually have a thriving building. And imagine if we did that every 4 or 5 buildings. The reduction on dependency on the current utility systems, what would that mean for our water systems? What would that mean for our everyday lives, when we had more people growing their own food, living in these centers, recirculating water differently, capturing water differently, that toilet that I mentioned, that's going to be part of that system, in terms of effluents that are coming out that, we are, recirculating with anaerobic bubbles. That's really what excites me about some of the work that you do is, really pushing the limits of tradition and nature in such a unique spot like New York or any major urban center.
Yeah, it is exciting in that way. It's a puzzle, right? And I think ultimately, if I could get to the heart of what I enjoy doing, what I feel like I've sort of evolved to be good at is troubleshooting, problem solving. Actually, I should say problem seeking is probably better than problem solving, because I think that just constantly in a place like this, and you said it yourself, I see opportunity every day I go outside, whether it's just out my front door here or in the city or wherever I visit. there's always a roof, there's always a lot, there's always space in this dense place that is just ripe for intervention. And so, which is why I like nature-based interventions as a term more than nature-based solutions, because it's sort of they're going to be different every time. And so, where I thought you were going initially was talking about sort of maybe a mini forest, and we're starting to actually see some of these based around this methodology, which of the Miyawaki sort of method of creating forests. There's certainly some debate around what that is, but I think ultimately it's not different than what was coined a very Dutch solution that we used on Governor's Island to plant out hammock grove there, and it relied upon a sort of more forestry type approach to bringing nature into the city, with the goal of really using the natural process of driving growth of other vegetation much quicker, so that we can get to that same result much faster. So,
and don't you have in New York as well a floating food forest somewhere?
There was, yes. I think that was a bit of a demonstration project. I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if that's still around or where it is. But yes, it was on. There might have even been more than one of them. They were on barges. I remember seeing them down at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and it was sort of I'll call it an educational journey, because I think it went around to different slits to start to show people what was possible. And Baltimore Harbor, in fact, and colleagues down there have really been exploring that for years. These sort of floating wetlands. Which is a concept that is becoming sort of more prolific also. And you talked earlier about the oceans. I mean, the oceans are just this untapped. And again, as a landscape architect, it's sort of like, no, it's not just land-based. Like, we got to think of the oceans as well, and the rivers. And that's why it goes back to the land is just so comprehensive around the world, that it is really a systems approach to thinking about how we all fit together harmoniously. I mean, that's the end result, right?
Yeah.
Which was kind of for me, it was more recently, kind of years in the making, but as a studio or an entity, I'll call it, that was intended to be a bit outside of myself, with the intention that it might grow at some point. But what if studio was really just built around this idea of curiosity, and I call it sort of designing the questions that change everything. And it's just that ability to constantly think about. It's empathic is what it is, because we're trying to create a place that is beneficial for everyone. If nature's not there, we're not surviving too long, right?
That's right. I second that, and we can put a big exclamation mark at the end of that and put that on a t-shirt. I guess there's two schools of thought, really, when I start thinking about some of the work that we do collectively, but in terms of landscape design, there's this idea of fixing those broken lines for both urban and non-urban areas where there's affluence, and sort of that education, and where can we push the limits. And then there's just design to access the under-resourced neighborhoods, and that could be rural, or that have as much financial constraint and under-resourced components as urban centers do. It's just some different factors. Right. But I think it's important that we focus in both areas, and at some point they're going to interact, but they actually function very differently. In an under-resourced area for our audience, neighborhoods that need to start reconnecting with their own edible food sources because they don't have the same grocery opportunities or food supply chains that intersect with those neighborhoods. That's the same with rural area. I was actually just working out with a gentleman who was doing some work in Saskatchewan just recently. He said, I was working in this little town in the middle of nowhere, and there was no restaurants, and we had to order in our food from like 45 minutes away, and it was coming to the it's a good Canadian sports town, so it had a curling rink, so they had to like order it into the curling rink. And I said, yeah, it's a different life when you live in rural, right? And we forget about that same constraint though is found in very urban centers where lack of resources to food becomes a hot topic. And we can design for both in different ways where we're actually creating some resiliency, or at least, creating different perspectives around, what food means and how to access it. And I think that's exciting
is. Yeah. It's food deserts, as we call them. Yeah. In an urban environment, which are exactly what you said. And it's a systemic, inequity that has been around for a long time and that has become highly politicized. It's become very sort of at the fore of things. I won't say that's led to a super impactful change on a sort of immediate basis, but at least there's discussion happening and how we can sort of solve this. And this idea of technology, and technologies that are available to us, we're always constantly learning about too, and it's impossible to try and keep up with it all because they're coming online so quickly. But there are resources out there for governments, for practitioners, for everyone that the metrics are already being tracked, and so it's about how we assemble that information and communicate it to be able to create sort of effective change, and that. Thinking specifically of equity maps. And so this is something that if we can identify it, then we can fund it, and then we can actually build it. And so, I take it, there was a gentleman at this conference this past weekend who, part of our game changer kind of cohort, if you will, talked about the school system and the Department of Education in any one county or state. Even if you took every single school and transformed that into not only better play spaces, but more natural spaces. Because if you, any urban city, the schools are hard. And I'm painting a broad generalization here a bit because there are exceptions that have popped up. But if we aggregate these, that's a huge impact on the overall inputs and outputs to not only better education, more contact is sort of to go back to the psychology of it all, more contact for children early on in their lives to sort of become stewards of it later. And then ultimately, perhaps even better, healthier food that they can have while they're at school. And any access to the community. And it also becomes a community building aspect. So like a pretty phenomenal idea that's really simple in its concept. We just have to figure out like what are the mechanisms and the policy and the political will to actually make that happen. Otherwise, it's a no-brainer to me.
And not to place a flag in the blockchain that Grow is leveraging in different ways.
Yeah.
And maybe you can expand on this a little bit, but I actually think some of the constraints points are, as you mentioned, we're collecting data, we're seeing the metrics.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, at some point, this human greed or ego takes over, and those data points get manipulated, changed to fit somebody's narratives, to fit a new campaign message. And so we need the tools that are available to us that are very much there, like a blockchain, to say, the data is the data. And, when we can just trust that it's no longer being manipulated and used, we can actually pull off it to, create better systems from the school forward, integrate community with education, not have it just be a September to June initiative. It's a 365 initiative that happens year round. And I was speaking to that in actually the Toronto area, not too far from you, a little bit north across the border. They have a school garden, and they're teaching kids how to get familiar with growing the basics, tomatoes and cucumbers and carrots. But every summer during the peak growing season, it dies off. And I said, well, no, it should be a 365 initiative for that local community. I mean, we've got little grocers, independent all around. Your downtown Toronto. Kids are looking for something to do during the summer. Have summer programs around it. And so it came back to, well, what are the data points to show success? Where do we pull those data points? And then how do we get the funding? And I offered, obviously there's the blockchain for data capture and immutability. And then there's the decentralized finance if there isn't your traditional finance mechanisms. And so we can create some gamification through, NFT programs. It's just using a tool, part of the Web3 or blockchain technology to create some kind of like crowdfunding. We can align that with some of the traditional finance mechanisms that you would see in donor relations, and how does money come in. But the blockchain can allow us to track the spend of that, so it doesn't feel like you're donating and paying somebody's wage versus the money going to where it needs to. So I think we just need to continue to be innovative with this tradition and technology and continue to design it effectively. And that design happens, at the landscape level, the field soil level, all the way through to our technology. And I actually see it as a cascading component.
Yeah, I would support that too. And it's like I said, it's one of the things that you've inspired me to sort of, I would say, continue to advocate for, because you talked about the sort of trust and immutability of the blockchain itself and the technology of it, but ultimately sort of the verification and sort of, I'll call it the blessing, if you will, of that data in some way. Someone has to kind of control it in the end, initially, or sort of, I don't know, you can tell me. It's the DAO, is that right?
The DAO, yeah. Decentralized organization theory, for sure. Yeah.
And so I'm thinking of, again, sort of take it back to sort of our professional body in the US, at least, and Canada has their own version in the CSLA, but the ASLA here, for example, could be that organization that moves beyond its current role, which is essentially advocacy and convening of sort of thought leadership, but to make it more of an ethical and sort of procedural backbone for that to happen. And so that inherently comes with a governance framework and a structure that is as more trustworthy, and that is then applied to this distributed ledger, which again sort of further democratizes the process to fund the work that we're doing. Because and I sort of closed off my own session this weekend by saying that if we don't build that, somebody else will, and their values aren't going to be the same as the people that are inherently involved in actually doing that work. So it's to me, it's not like a choice. It's what we need to do, and it's what needs to happen.
I love it. Well, Blair, I love talking to you, and I know we could go on and on. We like to keep these conversations sort of 35, 40, 45 minutes.
Digestible. Eh?
Yes, digestible for the audience for sure. I'd love to take the last remaining moments just maybe to turn the floor over to you in terms of, one, people had interest in reaching out to Blair to do some work, where and how could that happen? Maybe even before that, if there's anything interesting going on in your neck of the woods or in the landscape design market space as a whole. And three, I'd love for you to share one neat project that you're working on right now and what sort of that entails from a design aspect. So if you could cover those three things in the next few minutes, that'd be amazing.
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. I mean, I keep a pretty regular presence on LinkedIn, and just that's my name. You can Google it and probably find any number of ways. I do try to keep it focused around sort of that as a platform, just because I feel it still holds some degree of professional ism. But I am in the Insta world as well, for what it's worth, to maintain some presence. But and then certainly my website, which is just What If Studio, and that's .io within that. So or blairguppy.com. And I think like I said before, we cultivate relationships, which are really just land, people, and possibility.
Yeah.
I've worked and do work on very complex sites, and help clients really simplify complexity and sort of simultaneously expand possibilities. So that ultimately saves them time and money. And really, it's about delivering beauty and harmony in our environments. Um, the second part to that, I think, some of the work that I've been more recently involved with, that I've found personally and professionally kind of nourishing, is within certainly my own community, and that's both privately and publicly. And one of those is, I live in South Slope, Park Slope of Brooklyn, and
Okay.
we just recently released a visioning plan that was done by architectural colleagues here in Brooklyn, that like to think I've had a part in shaping, what that is, particularly in the immediate environment. But ultimately, it's about turning a very diverse and rich community into, saving it from becoming, overly gentrified, and turning it into a pedestrianized, more greener,
Right.
place. And so that's really rewarding to me. And I think it will be. It has legs. It has political backing locally, and so hopefully
Right.
that will continue on. What else? Did I answer your questions?
Yeah, I think you combined 2 and 3 there in that one sort of digestion of what you're currently working on. That's really fun, and
Yeah.
something in your local area. And I think that's wonderful, and really wonderful to hear that there's some multi-tiered stakeholders involved in that project in particular. It's
Yeah.
a piece we didn't touch on, but along with the finances, those components of stakeholdership that are involved in some of these very intricate projects that align, jurisdictional areas with urban dwellers and everyone else that wants a piece of the pie. So yeah,
We're
great,
gonna
good work.
become, I think we're going to become. My hope is that we become almost a benchmark within the city. There's a few other places that are really leading on this in different ways. But just this morning, I was talking to the executive director for the bid here, and this idea of mini forests, and starting, this discussion, and the pedagogy, and the language around it is starting to sort of
Yeah,
take hold, take root.
I
So
love it. I love it. I love
yeah,
it. Well, I'll be following along closely with that. The other spot to find Blair Guppy, for those of you that are part of our Grow community, is on our Nourish Mart. He does have a spot there where you can
yes,
reach out to him and you can connect with him. And if you're using the Grow tokens, he's starting to become an advocate of some of this decentralized finance, as you've heard. So please go check him out there if you're part of our community. And if you're not, and you're listening, as you mentioned, all the wonderful areas, we'll put his links in the bottom of this podcast here. But Blair, thank you so much for taking some time this morning.
yeah,
I look forward to many more conversations, much work that we can co-develop on as we continue to bridge the agriculture regenerative design space with your landscape architectural world. Much of the same, just different verbiage, and continuing to fix those broken lines. I think that's a really common thread that both of you and I believe in. So appreciate
yeah.
it.
And what if design could be as alive as the world we serve, right? So, yeah, thanks for having me, Neil. It's good, always good to see you. And yes, I hope the listeners found this useful.
Wonderful. Thanks
Talk
all.
to you
See you on the next
soon.
episode. Bye.